All right, hello everybody. Thank you for having me. And I want to start by seeing some hands up. So who has heard of Backstage? Okay, a lot of people. Who has, or who's using Backstage in their teams? Okay, some less people, so that's great. Backstage recently was named the third fastest growing project in the Kubernetes space. And that is super exciting. And actually, yesterday, we achieved 24,000 stars on GitHub. So the project is growing, the attention is growing, the momentum is really high. So with all that in mind, the question that often you might be asked is whether it's Backstage for me. And I am Jorge Lainfiesta. I am a technical product marketing manager at Spotify, specifically dedicated to the Backstage part, the open source part only, because at Spotify we have this like church and state divide between the commercial offering that is now available for Backstage from Spotify and the open source side, and I'm on the open source, so I'm on the good side. Also the author of the Linux Foundation Introduction to Backstage. I've been around the Backstage ecosystem for a while. I also studied digital communication in Aalborg University. But in the Copenhagen campus, and I have never been to Aalborg. I'm sorry I didn't go to the parties. But talking about Denmark, did you know that there's 17 species of bats in Denmark? And most of them are in the south, in Sørenborg. Bats are incredible creatures. They are the only flying mammals, as you know. And as you probably also know, they also cannot see. They use a kind of sonar, they emit sounds, and then based on the feedback, they know whether there's an obstacle or not. And a less known sound that they emit is made by baby bats. Baby bats have a special signal to call their parents for help. So when they need help, they emit a special signal that is crucial for the survival of baby bats, because they may be in danger, they maybe need food. And maybe I got very nerdy about bats by making the presentation, but for every 5 mammal species, there's 1 bat species. So that means there's a lot of bats. And they are all quite different. And I want to look into 2 very radically different ones. First is the Tadarida brasilensis, which is very common in Brazil, as you can expect, and in Mexico. And the Nyctichenov's schlafeni. And the most radical difference is that the Brazilian one can live in communities of up to 2 million bats that live together, they hunt together, do everything together. So that's when you have these pictures of these massive clouds of bats flying around. It's probably this type. While this other one lives alone with its offspring. This is more common in Africa. So that means that the social interactions of the 2 species are radically different. So much so that their bodies are different. They have evolved in a different way. And the one that is more social and lives in a more dynamic environment actually developed much larger call recognition to hear that the baby that's screaming is their baby and not one of the other 1.9 million baby bats that are just hanging out, because they need to feed their child, not somebody else's child, because resources are scarce, and they care about their children mostly. So that you can see that there's even, like the ears are different, even at the brain level is different, so they can pick up different signals. And this is not a trait that is exclusive of bats. There's actually a whole hypothesis in biology called the social complexity hypothesis, which states that more complex social systems require more complex communication systems. And this is true as well for many species of birds. For example, hummingbirds that only mate with 1 partner during their life have a much smaller song repertoire than birds that have several mates throughout their lives. And there's other science, for example, ants, they have a much more complex chemical footprint when they live in bigger colonies because they have different strata and stuff like that. And even though none of us are bats or ants or anything alike, we do form part of a complex kind of society, which is an engineering organization. So that means that we also require some complex way of communication, much more than other types of organizations within human operation. So that leads us to the question, is Backstage for me? And before we can answer that, we must ponder what even is Backstage. And for me, Backstage is a many-to-many communication medium in which you try to reduce the amount of noise, in which you can share information about your service, saying, for example, I am a service owner, I wrote this authentication package. So I want to tell my entire organization, hey, I built this, I maintain this is how you use it. But I can also learn from others that have the same level of ownership as me, and I can learn from third parties as well about my service. So I can get sneak data, I can get a cost of my operation, and all into a single pane of glass. So it puts together many dimensions of software making into one single space, so we have less to consume. And therefore, the question that you should ask is not whether Backstage as a thing is for me, but rather, which signals do you want to express in your platform? So what do you want to pick up? Just as bats need to be able to recognize their baby call, how do we recognize as a signal that matters to us in the middle of all the noise that there is in software organizations these days? How many emails do you get? How many Slack channels there are? How many Jira tickets? There's so much noise that we have to come up with a way of communicating more effectively. So let's look at an example signal that we may want to emit, or maybe somebody in your team. It's like, do we have a service or a library that can do X? And if I find it, how do I use it? Or how do I extend this thing that is already here, built by somebody else's team? And the usual procedure, I'm going to start pinging people in the Slack to see if I can find that, or I'm going to have this conversation. Oh, you know, Elena logged these systems a few years ago. You can find it in Jira. And you're like, do we even use Jira? And you can visit in Confluence pages. They are all about the same subject, and they are the definite guide, but they are all outdated. And then you get to the repo, and it's like 2 years old. So it's like all this discovery, and it's going to be like pointless. Let's look at another signal. Something is failing. Who can help me with this? And if this fails, is something else going to fail? Do we even know that? So let's start the normal process for doing this. Email chain. Oh, I know, maybe this person is related, or maybe this, and then you end up with a lot of CC people just copying your emails, trying to find a way your way out of this incident. Or, for example, oh yeah, I think that guy built it, but he's no longer here in this company. Or you get these Zoom meetings with like a lot of blank screens. Nobody's saying anything, nobody's showing up, but there's something going on. Somebody wants to find out something. And we're all sitting here, but nobody really knows, but we still have to be there somehow. Really? What is that? Like, just this project does that, and that's it, right? Because it's self-documented code, right? Okay, so these are normal processing information for these kind of signals. So it's not that our teams are bad at communicating or are lazy, or the developers or operators or whatever don't want to be good communicators. The problem is that the tools that we have are just not enough for the complexity that we manage. We cannot expect an email thread or a Jira ticket or a Confluence page or a Notion page to aggregate all the dimensions of a software development lifecycle and all the infrastructure aspects of it. So that's why, just as the social bots, we can evolve the system that we can use to communicate. However, bots had thousands of years to evolve their systems, and we don't have thousands of years to evolve our system of communication. So we have another process, which is called Backstage. Backstage is an open source framework, as you know, for creating developer portals. And I'm going to showcase how, for example, Backstage has some features that could be useful for the signals that I expressed before. So for instance, we have first the catalog that can help us answer the question, do we have a service for X? The catalog can theoretically list all of the assets of the company. That goes for listing components, listing services, listing APIs. At the Spotify, they even have AI models, they have data pipelines, and it's all documented in the catalog, so people can find what has already been built and how to use it. Because in the catalog, you can also find documentation. So it's a centralized hub to learn everything about your organization in a structured way. Because you can also track dependencies, you can track ownership, which is very important these days. And yeah, the other part of the catalog is that you can dig deeper into each entity and see what is it about this. So let's say I find something that can be useful, but it's not enough to know that something exists. You need to know what it does, how it does it, who should I ping if there's a problem, if I want to learn more. So you can track that, you can see the dependencies. So who's using this software? Because as you're a maintainer of a tool, for example, you want to know who are your clients. So if you want to make an update into your APIs, you need to know who you have to contact because they're consuming your API and you don't want to break anything else. So this can help you track who's using your APIs so you can plan better how to make these changes. It's not only about the software itself, but you can also plug in external things into the catalog in the entity view. For example, you can have SonarQube connected to your entity, and then in this single page, you're gonna get SonarQube notifications, you can get Argo CD set up, and you're gonna get also Argo CD notifications and statuses. Pretty much any tool that you can put in here, because Backstage is built as it's like a plugin architecture, which means that you can plug in many other things, including your own things, which is one of the most. So last week at BackstageCon, there was a presentation by David Tweet, who's the CEO of a Backstage that offers a company that offers Backstage, and he made a survey on 20 adopters that had used Backstage over the past 2 years. And one of the common traits that he found on the successful adopters is that most of them had custom plugins, which means that they have integrated the specific company workflows into Backstage. So that means that it's not only about generic information about your service, but you can create something in Backstage that maps how your organization works. And this is very common. For example, if you have a specific way of requesting permissions in your organization, you can build that workflow into Backstage so it can become a self-service movement instead of trying to create a ticket or not knowing how to figure out the roles. That's something that you can also build on top of Backstage and have it all connected with the catalog. However, Backstage is a framework, and that is what makes it powerful, but that also is what has not always been understood, because people see the demos, people see the developers, people see what Backstage can do for them allegedly, but every organization is unique, and you cannot just say like, oh, I'm just gonna be just like that company that adopted it, I'm gonna just, CLI, download Backstage, boom, everything is solved. You have to actually put the effort into doing something with it. And therefore you must have difficult questions, like, if I'm gonna use the catalog, who is the catalog useful to? Is it useful to me because I built it and I succeeded into making this technology work? Or is it useful for my developers? Or is it useful for my manager? Or is it gonna be useful for the CEO? Or is it gonna be useful to no one? And when you're building the catalog, you have to minimize the friction, because as Nicola was saying, there's this human factor that is very important in Backstage as well, because you're trying to tell people that we're just working in isolation, that now they have visibility over what they do, and they can also see other people. So that's it doesn't sound like it, but when you experience it, it can be like a shocking cognitive load and something that maybe some teams don't want to do because they like to work on their own. And finally, the catalog, if it doesn't bring value, you should feel free to ditch it, because this is just one use case of Backstage. Even though it's probably the most popular one, whenever somebody talks to you about a developer portal, the first thing that comes to mind is a catalog. But there's many adopters of Backstage that simply do not use the catalog, because it requires you to set up a catalog, and not everybody has time to set it up. I was literally talking to somebody here on the lounge that said that they looked into Backstage, but they already have too many software components, and they didn't want to go to the trouble of putting them into a catalog. So they said, oh, we're not going to adopt Backstage. Even though they were interested in the documentation part, in the scaffolder part, they said, oh, because the catalog is going to require time, and I want to spend time on that now, we're just going to ditch the entire thing. But you can just ditch the catalog. You can use it by pieces, Backstage. So next is looking for more signals. Those signals that I provided were just 2 examples of things that you may be looking into. But when you are thinking about a new technology, and that goes for Backstage as well as for anything else, what you want to know is, what can I solve with this? So when you adopt Backstage or any developer or platform development tool, I like to see it as, people often go as if they are like window shopping. They go and they're like, oh, these providers, they look so cool, like nice graphics, check, 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 check. But it's more like shopping for a nice outfit rather than trying to solve business use cases for your team. So that's something that I think is very easy to fall into, because we are bombarded by marketing all the time, and maybe I'm a bit guilty of that. But yeah, my point is that it's better to look for signals, as Batman and bats do. They emit signals and find signals. And that means asking the hard questions that probably you don't want to answer, because you don't want to know what's wrong about your developers, as the person from Reddit that said people hated my platform. Because you might find out, the moment you start asking, what do you think about the platform, your developers are going to be like, it sucks. So most people are not ready to hear that, but that's something that we must be asking in order to moving forward. So let's look at some other possible signals. For example, your company is growing. You need to hire people. And how do we onboard them? It's not the same to say, oh, we're going to hire one person, so they're going to dedicate, the manager is going to be there, they're going to have an onboarding body. If you're growing fast and you need 5 new people, are you going to make an ad hoc process for each of them? Are you going to keep one dedicated person for each of them full-time? That's going to be expensive. It's not scalable. So that's an important signal to consider. Or what is the path to production? How am I going to teach these 5 new people how to get to production? Do we have these answers? And this is how it usually looks like. The new hire, first day, and she's like, okay, what should I do now, right? I'm just new, you should tell me what to do. But turns out, there's just so many places to go to. They are using Angular, React, even Ember in one of the projects. So she's like, okay. Next step is, this person spends an entire week just poking at things, oh, there's this part here. Oh, now I can go here. Oh, turns out all of it is old, and we don't use that anymore. But she already spent the whole week trying to figure out what to do because nobody told her anything. And then she makes something because she was tasked to do something, and then the manager's like, why are you using AngularJS? And we're like, that's how the onboarding document said. Because nobody had bothered to update the onboarding document in years or whatever. Somebody built it and they forgot about it. So these kind of things are normal. And then the classic. Everybody's just too busy to help them out. So that's just the reality. We cannot hire people and expect them to figure out everything on their own, or to have the whole team dedicated to the new person, because this is just not going to happen in real life. So that's one of the signals for, when like the bat signal, then instead of Batman, Backstage shows up to the crime scene. With software templates in this case, because software templates or the scaffolder are a great way of creating golden paths, which is an extraordinary way of onboarding new team members. And I can talk from recent experience at Spotify. I was hired like 3 weeks ago. And they have golden paths, so you can learn how they do things. So there's paths for like Android development, paths for iOS, paths for web, paths for Node. So I chose the web path because that's the only thing I do. And they have like this very nice material on how to walk through, how to connect to the system, how to request permission. Because when you are working there day to day, you don't notice what a new person needs because you have everything set up. So, but for me, it was useful to have some very guided path to go from I have access to not even GitHub to, oh, I can push to production in like a day because it's all documented and you can just follow along. And if you have questions, you can ask them, which is different from, oh, I'm going to sit next to you the whole day trying to onboard you into all the things that I don't know. So that's one very useful case for software templates, but there's many others, like, for example, migrations. Let's say that we're going to migrate our Docker image, and that requires some changes in the code base across hundreds of services. So if you need it to be a self-service thing, instead of Teams opening a ticket for you to go and do it yourself, you can automate it through a software template as well. So they can start adopting new practices. The next new signal is, oh, we need to promote this new Z practice because compliance is going to require an audit of our services. So we really need people to do these new practices because otherwise they might close. We might have to close shop. Usually what happens, I create a very careful repo with a beautiful README. Everything you need to know about this practice is going to be so easy. Everybody's going to start using it. Nobody will look at it. And it's going to see a beautiful example just going to the trash because nobody will look at your example to adopt the new practice. Another, oh, sorry, we missed your adhere. My team is too busy. We're going to add a ticket for later to make your migration thingy. Because it's not their priority. Why would they try to bother with it? Or you start going through the manual path. I'm like, oh, I'm going to check what these people are doing. So you start going repo by repo to see if they start using your practice, and you give up. After 25, it's like, no, I'm not going to check 300 repos to see if everybody's using my new practice. And you send out a survey saying, have you migrated? Nobody reads it, nobody responds, you get no data. So that's another bad signal for Backstage. In this case, of course, I'm biased to Soundshake, but there's an open source alternative as well called Tech Insights in Backstage that provides primitives to build this kind of checks. But now there's also Spotify's solution, which is like a GUI-based way of making checks on your code bases that are linked to Backstage. So you can test things like, are tests good enough throughout our systems, or is our security vulnerabilities reaching the expected criteria? You can check really anything, versions. It's one of the things that I think are essential in Backstage. And that is to say that you have to be critical when you adopt Backstage or anything in the platform space, especially because you're going to affect a lot of people's way of working. And standardizing practice and metrics, it's not just saying, oh, we're going to be good. No, it's like a really time commitment to a goal for a reason. It's going to take time. So you have to make sure that what you're doing is aligned with everybody else, and you have to reach some consensus, which other departments as well, outside engineering alone, to make it really stick. And templates and metrics are things that you have to maintain. It's not something that you build and then you forget. It's something you're going to keep updating forever, or you're going to have the Angular example that I described earlier. And yeah. So when we say, is Backstage for me? The real question is not about, oh, I have 5 engineers, I have 50 engineers, I have 100, I have 10,000. It's more about, how do you want to communicate the complexity of your system, and knowing that it's not magic. So you have to put the real work of setting it up and do the work to make it useful. And you're going to have this slide available, but I just did some common use cases for Backstage and some of the features that Backstage offers and what can cover what. And that's pretty much all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, I will run.
Very far.
Hi. So this might be trying to put a square peg into a round hole, but all the while I was thinking about this catalog and how there's not only developers, but there's marketing, there's sales, there's all other kinds of people, and they don't necessarily use code, but they do use cloud apps. And sometimes you have this guerrilla style type of, I'll just sign up for this app, and suddenly you have a second person that suddenly wants to sign up and can see the organization is already created and they need access. Would Backstage fit that round hole somehow with the square peg, that you could actually manage cloud apps in the same way through Backstage rather than only repositories, or is it too specific for code?
No, yeah, you can integrate many things. It's not only code. Yeah, you can. Now there's a lot of examples, but what for example, you can like, I don't know to what extent you want to limit the access to website, because of course you can.
I'm not thinking about limiting, just actually basic asset management stuff, like you have accounts on Adobe Cloud. You don't even need to track the individual accounts, just simply knowing that there's somebody doing, who do you need to contact when you're signing up, SOMI accounts, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. That kind of lives diffusely somewhere in the organization, but you don't ever know who manages it.
Yeah, I mean, I know the example of Spotify, because Spotify has everything in Backstage, but for example, to request a software license, you can also do it through Backstage, because they have a plugin called band management that allows you to sign up for roles. So if you have a certain role, some permissions are granted to you, so you can request roles that come with stuff. So for example, I was hired as marketing, so I didn't have access to GitHub. So I had to request access to the dev group, and automatically after I request access to the dev role, I get access to GitHub and another tools that are it's all like automated, so I get access to all the tools that you need as dev. And it's the same for other specific roles that you can control.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
I will go up. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are using Backstage and especially the catalog in our company already, but we had the problem when we did our POC. We took the Backstage documentation on how to onboard things, gave this to 3 teams, and had 4 different structures of how they were onboarded. Do you have any solution about that, or does it simply not matter if different teams onboard in different ways? How are you handling this?
Yeah, it's a question that depends on how you are trying it out, because there's indeed different ways of onboarding components and entities, because the idea is to make it so people have different setups, so you can just use it. But I have never tried making like a mixed approach. Usually it's just whatever works best for the workflows of your team, you can do. So for example, if you, like the classic one is just making YAML files in repos, and everybody can onboard their YAML file, and it's going to be registered on Backstage automatically. So yeah, I don't really know what to say because I may be too close to the source. But yeah, I think you can use them all together because, for example, you can have your LDAP connected into Backstage, and that's going to create a certain number of entities that are users and groups, teams, and you can also ingest components through YAMLs, and you can also ingest infrastructure through AWS, for example, and you can have it all. It has 3 different sources of things, so I think they can be combined. So I would need to know just specifics of your use case. Yeah.
Hi. It might be simple, but I'm curious about the workflow handling in Backstage. Does it come with a workflow engine, or do I need to sort of look at existing workflow engines in the community?
What do you mean with workflow engine?
Like Camunda or Temporal or something like that, being a workflow engine handling sort of the logic around workflows?
No, I don't know. Backstage doesn't come with workflow management. No.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I have one.
Do it.
So I saw a few hands raised when you asked how many people actually are using Backstage. So what, if you should give one advice to people that are not doing Backstage right now, where should they get started? And yeah, how can they prove sort of the most value at the company by adopting Backstage?
Yeah, this is a great question because it's my favorite one. But I'm a big fan of the software template, the scaffolder. I think it's the best way to get started with Backstage because it basically requires not much setup. You just install it, you write a template, and I've seen people that, so firstly, the scaffolder requires low effort from a technical standpoint to just put together the templates. And the great thing about software templates is that you can prove the return of investments relatively easy. For example, I know of some adopter who started using the scaffolder, and they took the time to find, like, okay, we have this process of deploying Azure apps or something. We wanted to deploy something to Azure, but because the way they made it, it took them like 4 weeks to get to production. So this person, he went through all the relevant parties and built a scaffolder template that allowed him to do it like in a few hours of doing that. So when you can reduce several weeks of work into a few hours, that's a very solid business case of why this is something that we have to pursue. It doesn't require much of investment to put it together, but it can prove the potential of Backstage and save time for you and your colleagues. So I think that's like the best way to get started with Backstage, is just automating these kind of workflows.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Please give a round of applause for Jorge.